The next tool we're going to look at for creating your terrain is the texture painting tool. Now this kind of moves us into the second phase for terrain generation. The first phase, of course, being sculpting out the general shape of your terrain. Now we're going to move on to painting out your textures. Then later on we'll talk about how you can decorate your terrain with trees and other sorts of details. Now to grab your texture painting tool, you just need to have a terrain selected. You can click on the little paintbrush icon, which opens up the texture painting tool, or you can hit Shift R, which jumps you right to it as long as you have a terrain object selected. The bulk of the settings for this tool are pretty much the same as what you saw with our terrain sculpting tools. And we have things like brush shape, we have brush size and opacity. We do have something new called target strength, and I'll talk about that here very shortly. But what I wanted to do was jump straight into adding textures, because right now all of these various settings are useless until we have some sort of a texture assigned.
Right, and when we add this very first texture, because there are no textures on our terrain as of yet, when this texture gets created, the entire terrain is going to take on this texture.
That's right. So I'm going to click on the Edit Textures button, click on Add Texture, and then here inside the Splat property, I will click on the little tiny load circle. Now, again, as Lee was saying, this texture I select is going to be applied all across the terrain. So I'm going to start with Cliff, Layered Rock. We'll double-click that. Now, underneath this, before we close out the Add Terrain Texture window, we can control the tiling of the texture. And this number controls the size of each tile. So the lower we set this, the tighter the tiling is going to be. We can also control the offset if we need to move the texture horizontally or vertically. However, for now, we'll leave these at their default values, click on Add, and suddenly the whole terrain is covered with this highly repetitious rock texture. Now, if this is your first time doing this and you get a little bit turned off by seeing so many different copies of the texture over and over again, remember that your player is going to be viewing this from really close on. And as you get a lot closer to a texture, the repetitive problem isn't nearly as prevalent. So we have our first texture laid down. Now just having one doesn't allow us to paint anything. We actually need a second texture in order to paint something down. So let's click on Edit Textures again. This time we'll click Add Texture, grab our little load button, and we will choose, let's grab one of these grass textures. So I have Grass Meadows 2. I'll double click that, and again we'll leave our values at default and click Add. Now we can paint down our texture, but we need to make sure we have the texture we want to paint selected. So I'm going to click on that grass texture swatch, and I'm not going to worry about my brush settings for now. Let's just click and paint. And you can see we're immediately painting down our grass texture. It doesn't get much simpler than that. Now all of our brush settings become a lot more important. Let me hit Control-Z. So we can choose a brush shape, and as you might expect, in this case, we would be painting down a star-like shape of grass if that's what we wanted to do. But we're not going to do that. We can control our brush size. So if I pull this way down, we have a tiny little brush. We can make it extremely large. Now I do want to mention something about brush size. The limit on our brush size is going to be controlled by the resolution we had established for our splat map. Now this means that if I make my brush size too small, we just get down to a single pixel looking brush. And that's just because we had created a very low resolution splat map for this particular terrain. Now I'll set this to something right about there, and we can just paint out. Now our other two values are opacity and target strength. Opacity is really going to be more, it's going to kind of control how quickly the texture comes out of your paintbrush. This is almost like an airbrush effect when you're using the texture paint tool. So currently our opacity is set to 50, and so if you're coming into this from a background in, say, a painting application such as Photoshop, you might be expecting that that texture to only come out at 50% opacity, but it really does seem to be covering up with 100% opacity. What this value is controlling is how quickly that texture gets dropped down. So if I pull this really, really far down, again, you'll see that it is filling in all the way, but what we've done is we've slowed down how quickly that gets applied.
Right, and it's being applied as you hold the mouse button and move your mouse cursor.
Right.
So if you go to an empty area and you just push down, it will stay at that first initial opacity. You've got it set down to 0 now.
Yeah, so we're not going to get anything.
Right.
So set it down to 1. Right now we just added 1%, but as I drag, each time I drag it gets darker and darker and darker until it eventually hits 100% opacity. Again, it's kind of like an airbrush. Kind of, sort of. Now, if we come down to target strength, this is where we control that opacity limit. For instance, if we set this to 0.5, this means we can only get up to 50% of our total opacity for this texture. So now as I paint and draw around in a circle, we're not getting any darker than 50%. And you can see where we have half grass and half stone if we get really close to the texture. So that is a quick look at actually painting our texture, but I'm not quite finished yet. There's a couple of things that I want to point out. First off, once you have dropped these textures down, that's not the end of the story, per se. You can still control a lot of things about the texture in terms of their tiling, in terms of their positioning. So let's just take a look at this cliff wall right here in front of us. I can select our cliff texture, click on Edit Textures, and we can choose Add Texture, and we can choose Edit Texture as well. So if I click on Edit, we get right back to this window that popped up earlier when we selected the texture. So I can change my tiling. Now, note the name of the property. It's tile size X. It's not like number of tiles or number of times this is getting repeated. The tile size is currently set to 15. If I decrease the tile size, we actually get more tiles. So if I set this to something like 1 by 1, you see we get a whole lot more tiles.
Now can you go to 0.5 and 0.5?
0.5 and 0.5.
Now where this would be useful is if you had a single texture that was a texture atlas. Let's say you had multiple textures on it and you wanted to optimize for performance. You could set up a texture that had 4 textures on it. You could set it to 0.5 and 0.5 and change your offsets.
And that's I see where you're getting at. Yeah, okay. But you'd have to have a very cleverly set up texture that you were using to paint down.
Yeah. It's a performance trick that you can use for mobile platforms.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to set these back to 1 for just a moment, and then let's make them really large. So let's do, say, 50 by 50, and there you go. And that might actually end up looking a lot better, though some of the shaded areas might break the realism because you wouldn't actually see those recess into the rock. You'd have to make that judgment call based on the design you're going for. We can also offset the tiling, so we could set this to, say, 0.5, and you'll notice as I increase the value, the texture starts to move with us. So if I kick this up to a value of 1, we're steadily marching across in X. Now I can drag this as well, and you can see that texture kind of sliding across. And we can do tile offset Y and do the same thing and move in the Y direction. So we'll go ahead and click apply there. Let's add another texture for just a moment. And let's see, which one am I going to add? Could be anything really. Let's see if we have that snow texture around here someplace. And let's see. There we go. Alphabetical order always helps. So now let's just paint down a little bit of snow. And I'll click Add, make sure I select it. And so now currently my target strength is set to 0.5. Let's lift that all the way up. And now I have this snowy area. At any point, I can decide, well, I didn't want that texture here anymore. I can click on Edit Textures and remove that texture. And that will default us back down to our base texture. So that's been pulled completely out of the mix. Now I do want to throw this little tidbit out there. You can add as many of these textures as you like to your terrain until you hit some sort of a limit with your hardware. But it is a good idea to make sure you're adding these in multiples of 4. That will utilize your splat maps most efficiently. So that's everything for painting down your textures. I mean, of course, we haven't really shown you how to paint a really good texture. That's just a lot of work and fine-tuning and controlling where you want everything. But it does show you how the tool works. Lee, is there anything else you want to throw in there?
The one thing that you saw kind of demonstrated when he removed the snow is you can also go back and paint over with an existing texture over textures that you've already painted.
That's true. I can at any point go down to the cliff texture, and let me bring down my brush size because it's a little bit ridiculous. And we can paint that back in.
Right. It's not permanent. Once you paint one texture, there's nothing that says you can't paint more textures over the top of it.
Oh, also, you can paint something down like so. Now let me kick up my opacity just a little bit. let me throw. I just want to throw one thing in here because there are some terrain systems on other platforms that are not Unity that behave in a layer-like fashion, where instead of being controlled by a splat map such as what we have here, they're controlled as if you really did place down a texture and then you paint a texture on top of that and you paint another texture on top of that. Unity is not that way. And what I mean by that is, check this out. I've dropped in a sandy texture, and I'm going to put this on top of my grass. And so if this was layer-based, you'd be thinking, well, we have our rock, and then we have our grass, and then we have our sand. But with Unity, we can go all the way back down to the rock, and we can paint that down. So it's not like we'd have to reach all the way down through our grass to see that. It's just, it's put the textures exactly where you want them to be. I just wanted to make sure that that was nice and clear. So that will wrap things up for this video. Thanks for watching.